this time around I've got 3 horror movies. Well, kind of 2 horror movies and 1 movie that's horror movie adjacent. The horror movie adjacent one's from 1993. The other 2, which are definite horror movies, are from 1985 and 1987. All 3 of them are kid-friendly but cool. When I say kid-friendly, it depends on the kid, of course. But they definitely have that 1980s kid movie feel about them, and they still have a little bit of depth to them, and one of them is extraordinary in one way. So let's start with the most recent one of them, from 1993. Filmed in Florida, for the most part, directed by Joe Dante and starring John Goodman and Joe Dante's usual repertory company. And it's a movie that I've been asked for on the channel. I just had to grab it there, so that's what that distracted look was for. It's a great movie, and I got a copy of it from Zavi. It's been released by Arrow Video. Matinee. Movie set in 1962, and it's set in and around the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's a boy called Gene who lives on a Navy base in Florida, with his mum, his father and his little brother, and his father's been put out to sea to do the Cuba blockade against the missiles that the Russians put there. So it's a very topical kind of movie for the current environment. Now, Gene is, as every kid in every movie set in 1963 or 1962 is, he's a horror movie buff. He reads Famous Monsters of Filmland. He likes horror movies, he knows them pretty well, and he is a proto-geek of the kind that we all know and love. In a sense, he's Joe Dante's viewpoint character in this film. Into town, a new movie is coming called Mant, and it is directed by a kind of William Castle type figure called Lawrence Woolsey, played over the top and wonderfully by John Goodman. He's going to be debuting the movie in town. He's going to be there for the movie, and he's getting a distribution guy to come and see a new process that he's created, especially for this film. Now, as Joe Dante says in the extras on the movie, it's kind of a combination of Burt I. Gordon and William Castle, because William Castle did straight up horror films and Burt I. Gordon did the giant monster ones. But it's still a love letter to the late 1950s, early 1960s horror cinema. Now, the look of the film's great. The movie really does have a kind of technicolor glow to it, and one of the things that the cinematographer says on the extras is they start out with a kind of flatter color palette on the movie, and as things get more and more absurd and more towards the climax in the film, they actually up the color values a bit. So it's something to watch for when you see the film. Lawrence Woolsey brings along his girlfriend slash star, played by Kathy Moriarty, who gets some really great lines in. She's got a really nice touch with the comedy in there. And you get the usual cast that you get in a Joe Dante movie. You've got Dick Miller and John Sayles in this one. John Sayles, one of the great screenwriters of the 20th century, really. If you haven't seen John Sayles' movie Lone Star, you are missing out. It's an incredibly powerful film. So you get Dick Miller, you get John Sayles, you get Robert Picardo running the guy who runs the cinema where the movie's going to be showing, and you also get Archie Hahn in there as well. If you don't remember Archie Hahn, he's the leader of the Juicy Fruits pop group in Brian De Palma's Phantom of the Paradise, amongst many other things. And Archie Hahn turns up in a really nice little trailer satire of those bland, slightly supernatural Walt Disney live-action kiddie films that they got in the early 1960s. And in the scene of that trailer, you also get Naomi Watts in a really early Hollywood role. So there's tons of little Easter eggs in this movie. And there are great movie posters on the walls of the cinema from around that time, all of which are from Joe Dante's movie collection. It's a great film, and it's, as I said, it's set right when the Cuban Missile Crisis is about to hit, and it kind of makes fun of that Cold War paranoia, but in a very loving and affectionate way. And there are a couple of times where Lawrence Woolsey, the John Goodman character, goes on a little bit of a speech about cinema and about why people love horror cinema and what people get from watching horror cinema. It's a really nicely written little piece, and it's delivered beautifully by John Goodman. His range in this character, who's part huckster, part showman, part movie buff, and definitely an unreliable character in some ways. It's just a wonderfully evoked, over-the-top character. The movie wasn't financially successful at the time. A money deal fell through, and eventually Joe Dante had to go to Universal Pictures when the movie was half made because the other producers basically didn't have any money. And he got Universal to let him finish the film. It didn't make a profit, really. It may have kind of broken even. But over the years, Matinee has got a hell of a good cult following. It's one of those movies that movie buffs like. It's one of those movies that horror movie buffs like. And it's got that combination of pastiche and satire and comedy, but also a little bit of heart and a little bit of affection for people who like sitting in dark rooms and watching electric shadows on a wall. I really like this film. Rewatching it was a lot of fun. It's really great too because if you listen to the soundtrack really carefully, you get a few bars of so many pop songs of the time, and you don't quite get enough time to Shazam some of them, so you'll have to look them up on IMDb. But it evokes the time really well. The costuming is all on point. The production design and the props and the sets are really great. It's easy to say the 1960s were a simpler time. I don't believe they were. I think they were an incredibly complex time, and some of the social issues that did afflict Western civilization at the time do get a little bit of airing in this movie. But I kind of like the fact that it gives us a different time, lets us step back in time in a way, and wraps it all around the kind of things that we like, which is giant ants, people who turn into ants. Oh yeah, that's what I forgot to mention too. Look at some of the smaller roles. You get Kevin McCarthy in there from Invasion of the Body Snatchers. You get William Shalett, who was in all sorts of horror movies in the 1950s. And you get Robert Cornthwaite, who was in the original Howard Hawks version of The Thing from Another World. It's just a loving and lovely little film, and it's got to be one of your feel-good movies. If you're a movie buff who likes 1950s, 1960s horror, this has got to be one of your go-to feel-good movies. There's no way it can't be. Anyway, that's the first one. The other two I got crazily cheaply, and I'll talk about them when I've had a glass of water. You know what one of the other movies is because I put it onto the title of this video, but I picked up for $10 maybe from JB Hi-Fi a double box set of 1980s comedy horror films, and for $10 it was worth it. I checked, I didn't have it in the collection here, which is behind the green screen, and so I bought it. They're both on DVD rather than Blu-ray, but for the price it was worth it, and they are The Monster Squad and Fright Night. Now, Cinema Cult put this one out a while back. It's very much a bare bones version of the films. There aren't any extras on it, but that's kind of okay. There are times when I don't need all the extras. It's nice to have them, but it's not a deal breaker for me. But the first one I'm going to talk about is The Monster Squad. And The Monster Squad I like for so many good reasons. First off, it is one of the first films that came out based on a script by Shane Black. Now, Shane Black we all know from many things, including, unfortunately, Iron Man 3. But he did Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, he did A Long Kiss Goodnight. Really great action film writer. Pretty good as a director as well. But this movie came out in cinemas about a month after another film that he wrote the script for, which kind of did okay, a movie called Lethal Weapon. But this one was one of his first sales, and it's a lot of fun. The movie's directed by Fred Decker, who co-wrote the script with Shane Black. And again, it's a great movie. It's a love letter to classic Universal horror films, even though it wasn't made by Universal. They get all of the gang back together without necessarily linking it into Universal's intellectual properties. At the start, you get to see Dracula do a fantastic transformation sequence. The physical special effects in this film are great for the time. They really do work. Duncan Regger plays Count Dracula, who is bringing Frankenstein's monster to America, because a magical gem that will let the monsters rule the earth is for some reason sitting in a swamp near a suburban neighborhood in America. The pilots bringing the crate with Dracula and Frankenstein's monster in it are flying a World War II bomber for reasons. And when Dracula starts attacking the flight crew, they open the bomb bay doors and Frankenstein's monster drops into a swamp. Dracula decides to get the other monsters back together. He finds a werewolf played by Jonathan Gries. He also finds a mummy in a local museum, which is kind of fortunate, and resurrects that. And also there's the Ghoul Man who pops out of the swamp. So you've got all of the classic Universal horror movie monsters, except it's not made by Universal. A group of kids live next to the swamp and have the coolest treehouse cubby house you've ever seen in your life. It almost made me cry when Dracula threw a stick of dynamite into the cubby house. But these kids form a monster club because they're all monster movie fans. They're probably the nieces and nephews of the character Gene from Matinee, maybe. And they are really cool fans of horror movie monsters, which causes a little bit of problem because they're not paying attention in school and they're totally focused on monsters. One of the kids goes around school wearing a t-shirt that says Stephen King rules. And there's lots of little Easter eggy things like that in it. So these little kids find Frankenstein's monster. Actually, the little sister of one of the kids, Phoebe, finds Frankenstein's monster and makes friends with him. Now, Frankenstein's monster in this movie is played by the wonderful Tom Noonan, and the makeup is really good. It looks a lot more like the Mike Ploog Frankenstein's monster from the Marvel Comics than it does the classic Universal movie monsters Jack Pierce Frankenstein, but it works. And Tom Noonan, who has the look for playing Frankenstein's monster, really does give us a sympathetic portrayal of this creature, and he is very good at acting through the makeup. They also make friends with a creepy old German guy who lives in what they think is a haunted house nearby, but it turns out he's the only person who can translate Van Helsing's journal, which for some reason one of the kids' mothers finds at a garage sale, and help them cast a spell to stop Dracula from resurrecting all the monsters and letting the monsters rule the earth. He's played by Leonardo Cimino, who was in The Godfather amongst other things, and also was in Hudson Hawk. I think he was in Hudson Hawk. But he has a long history as an actor. I looked into him on Wikipedia, and Leonardo Cimino started out with the Workers' Theatre that Orson Welles ran in New York in the 1930s. He was in the original production of Cradle Will Rock in the 1930s when he was about 20 years old, and had an incredibly long career as an actor. And his character gets the best hero moment in 1980s action cinema. I don't want to argue about it, but this moment where he's talking to the kids about how much he knows about monsters is a fantastic piece of writing, a fantastic piece of acting and direction. And it's one of those moments where you sit down and go, fuck yeah, when you watch it.
You sure know a lot about monsters.
Now that you mention it, I suppose I do.
It is just brilliantly done, and in fact there are a few different hero moments in this movie as well, which are very much a Shane Black kind of thing, but that moment is the one that really gets me. I love it to pieces. Now, one of the kids' fathers is a cop played by Stephen Mucht, and he's involved with a few cases, one of which is a guy who gets shot by the coppers and disappears from the ambulance, who turns out to be the werewolf. And the werewolf is kind of, doesn't get much airtime, but is a sympathetic character because, of course, being a werewolf is a curse. And we get a little bit of that in there as well. The mummy and the Gill Man don't get much to do because of the nature of the creatures, but having them along is great. And having this team of kind of kid misfits fighting against pure evil makes this movie just a lot of fun to watch. It is just such a 1980s comfort film, and it's joyous to watch it. I mean, all three of these movies in their own ways are comfort films. They're Movies that you probably know already, but they're movies that just make you feel good when you watch them. And I'm very glad that I've got copies of them now. That brings us to Fright Night and the secret source of Fright Night. Now, I'm going to ignore the 2011 remake of Fright Night because I did see it about 8 years ago. And I didn't like it. I don't think that Colin Farrell was particularly good playing Jerry Dandridge the vampire. I don't think that David Tennant was particularly good playing the character that Roddy McDowall played in the original, whose name is Peter Vincent, which of course is Peter Cushing, Vincent Price. The original is the best. There was also a sequel, but the sequel, as far as I can recall, isn't anywhere near as good. I'm going to concentrate on Fright Night, the original 1985 version, because that movie has a lot more going for it than I even remember from watching it previously. William Ragsdale plays a guy called Charlie, who's in high school even though he looks older. And Charlie is obsessed with horror movies. He's got a girlfriend called Amy, played by Amanda Bierce. And he gets kind of distracted from their necking whenever Peter Vincent's introducing horror movies on the television, because he's a horror movie host. A former horror movie actor, played vampire hunters and things like that in old movies. But this character is down on his skids. He's doing local television, playing a horror movie host.
I believe in vampires.
That's nice. If only there'd been a few more of you, perhaps my ratings would have been higher.
Charlie's best friend Ed is a geek and a bit of a loser and may well have a crush on Charlie as far as I know. And he's played by Stephen Jeffries. He gets some really nice moments in this one as well. And he gets a really good scene with Roddy McDowall, which you've got to just pay close attention when that scene comes up. I think it's a really deep scene in a lot of ways. Then, of course, you've got Chris Sarandon playing Jerry Dandridge, the guy who moves in next door who is a vampire. And we get a very different vampire with this one from anything we've seen previously. Previously, it's been all tuxedos and capes and children of the night. We get a little bit of that, but we don't get the tuxedos and the capes. Jerry Dandridge is very much an 80s good-looking guy who does tend to go through a lot of women to sate his thirst. And that's where Charlie sees him for the first time as a vampire, and decides that he's got to be stopped. Of course, the police won't help him. His mother won't help him. And he has no one to go to except Peter Vincent, the down-on-his-luck horror movie host, who his friends bribe to tell him that Jerry is not a vampire. Of course, Jerry is a vampire, and the mixed-up crew of Ed, Amy, Charlie, and Peter go up against a very powerful vampire. Now, here's the secret source in this movie. Roddy McDowall. Roddy McDowall's Peter Vincent is really, really nuanced. He's kind of a vulnerable guy who's old, he's aged, and he's living in a small flat, knows his career has gone nowhere, and he's just got the sack from being a horror movie host because that kind of thing isn't really in style anymore. And so he's the kind of guy who's at a vulnerable point in his life. And suddenly these kids come along. He finds out that vampires actually exist. And it terrifies him. He is shit scared of the vampire and shows it. He's not afraid to be scared. And it's only when he realizes that Charlie is going up against the vampire and Amy has been bitten by the vampire and Ed has been bitten by the vampire that Peter Vincent really finds his own courage and finds his best self helping Charlie kill this vampire. And the battles with the vampire are really great. The special effects are superb. The transformation sequences for Jerry are really good. The makeup is all really interesting and well done. There's a really interesting sequence in a nightclub which builds the tension wonderfully. Tom Holland does a great job on that scene. And the movie does give us this complex characters. I mean, Charlie and Amy are kind of less complex, but Ed and Peter Vincent, and also Jerry to a certain extent, and he's Renfield as well. He's got a Renfield kind of guy. The actors are really giving it their best. They're giving it everything they've got. They give it more than this kind of movie really requires in the VHS days of yore. I like it when actors make really good acting choices in movies that don't actually require them to. Maybe it's because I'm older, but I think it may even be for younger people. Peter Vincent becomes a viewpoint character much more than Charlie does. Charlie's a dork. Charlie's a bit of an idiot. Charlie is naive as hell. But Peter Vincent ends up becoming the protagonist in a lot of ways. And I like that. I like that shift between the two. Because Charlie couldn't do it without Peter Vincent, but I think Peter Vincent could do it without Charlie. And it's one of Roddy McDowall's great later roles. In fact, it may well be his only really great later role as an actor. And he started out as a child actor in the 1940s. Just watching this film and watching the level of acting that particularly Chris Sarandon and Amanda Beers and Stephen Jeffries and Roddy McDowall give it really makes this movie a better film than we expect it to be, and a better film than I remember it being, which is really cool. All three of these movies are love letters to classic horror films. At the time, The Monster Squad was compared unfavourably to The Goonies, but I've watched them both recently, and for me, The Monster Squad is a much more enjoyable film than The Goonies, which has a little too much Steven Spielberg in it for my taste. And these three movies were a lot of fun to watch, just sitting down on the couch with the popcorn and going through a little bit of 1980s nostalgia. And thematically, the movies hold together too, because they are literally about movies and about the kind of films you and I like. So thank you very much for watching. If you did enjoy the video, please consider liking, subscribing and leaving a comment. You can also donate to support the channel at patreon.com/paleocinema. So anyway, look after yourselves, stay warm, stay safe, stay cool if you're down here because it's very humid today. Watch some good horror movies, don't watch some bad horror movies, just leave that off for this week. Take care of yourselves and I'll catch you next time.